Hello everybody and welcome to the second video in our series of videos on Ireland between 1932 and 1990. Today we are going to be looking at what life was like in Ireland during World War II, also known as the emergency, and what happened in the aftermath of the emergency. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes, so by the end of this presentation you guys should know what the terms neutral, rations and Glimmer mean. You guys should know the three major threats to Irish neutrality. And finally, you guys should know three things about life in Ireland during the emergency. So as we saw in our study of war and peace in Europe and the world between 1920 and 1945, on the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. This triggered the beginning of war in Europe, also known as World War II. Ireland declared itself neutral when World War II broke out. That means that they were not going to take sides or engage in the war in any way. So why did Ireland declare itself neutral? First thing is they wanted to show their independence from Britain. And the second thing really was Ireland was too weak to fight a war with these huge European armies. At the beginning of September 1939, the Irish army had only about 6,000 regular troops. They were poorly trained, poorly equipped. We had no anti-aircraft guns. We had nothing that could defend us in any way. There were, however, some threats to Irish neutrality, and probably the biggest one came from within the country. This was from the IRA. When De Valera came to power, he had released IRA prisoners. However, these prisoners, they continued to want to use physical force to fight for a completely independent Ireland, an Ireland that would include the north of Ireland, and this caused an awful lot of issues for the Fianna Fáil government. So the IRA, they continued to clash with the blue shirts, who we met in our last video, and they would go to any Cumann na nGaedheal meetings saying that no free speech for traders was the motto that they used, that these people should not be allowed to speak freely as they were traitors to the Republic. They carried out multiple high-profile murders in the 1930s, killing people even for helping people enlist in the British Army. It got to a point that eventually in 1936 De Valera had to ban the IRA again. Another big issue was that in 1939 the IRA began what they called Operation Harvest, which was a bombing campaign in Britain. So in 1939 they bombed Coventry in England, killing many civilians. In December of 1931 they had one of a particularly eventful heist known as the Christmas Raid, in which they stole 1 million rounds of ammunition from the depot in the Phoenix Park. There was also evidence found of IRA communications with Nazi spies. Remember, the IRA motto of England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. They still felt that they were fighting a war with the British and were willing to work with the Nazis, and the Nazis were willing to work with the IRA also to try to undermine the British. Because of this, IRA members were executed by the Fianna Fáil government due to these attacks, and this really led to a weakening of the IRA also. The two other threats to Irish neutrality were the Germans and the British. Germany had actually planned an operation to invade Ireland. This was known as Operation Green. It never really materialized, as they felt it was too much of a diversion from what they wanted. But that there was documents drawn up for Operation Green, but it never materialized. There were, however, bombs dropped in Ireland during World War II. At the North Strand in Dublin, 34 people were killed in a bombing in May of 1941. The other threat to Irish neutrality came from Britain. Winston Churchill was desperate for Ireland to join the war so England could use its ports to patrol the Atlantic. Remember, Ireland had got back the treaty ports in 1938, so Churchill wanted to be able to use the ports for the Battle of the Atlantic. He even offered to end partition if De Valera joined in, but De Valera declined, believing that it was something that Churchill could not actually deliver upon. There had even been talks of Britain invading Ireland as well, just to get used to the ports, but that never materialised either. During the war, Ireland had a policy that if there were soldiers from either the Allies or the Nazis or the Axis powers, as they're known, if they landed in Ireland, that they would be interred in the Curragh camp. Generally speaking, the prisoners were treated quite well and were given days out. There's stories of them being allowed to study in college and stuff like that. However, in 1943, they took all allies out of these camps and set them free, but kept the Germans still imprisoned. But at the end of the war, they released the Germans back to Germany. While Ireland was neutral, it definitely favoured the Allied sides. They would share weather forecast reports with the British, which would help them to get a better picture of potential air raids, potential launching attacks and stuff like that. So while they did remain neutral, there definitely was certain favours given to the Allied side. Within the actual country itself, there was a lot of deprivation, there was a lot of shortages within the country, and this led to rationing. Sean Lemass, who we will be talking about in more detail later on, he became the Minister for Supplies, and rationing was introduced. They introduced rationing on food, clothes, footwear, and petrol because of all the shortages. People were given ration books, which looked like this, in which you were only allotted a certain amount of the scarce materials every week. A new job became quite popular, known as the Glimmer Man, and the Glimmer Man called houses to make sure that people weren't using up the limited gas that was left in the country. There was such a fuel shortage that by 1942, more than 26,000 people were employed in over 800 bogs to supply turf. England wouldn't export its coal to Ireland. They felt they weren't an ally. They didn't want to share this precious resource with the Irish, so they weren't exporting it to the Irish. So the Irish had to come up with an alternative, which was turf cut from the bogs. But it wasn't enough to prevent power cuts and transport paralysis. Cars were pretty much non-usable at this point in the country. Power cuts and power outages were something that were very common also. Ultimately, what we're looking at here is Fianna Fáil stayed in power for the next 3 years until 1948. And they ruled Ireland from 1932 to 1948. And while De Valera politically achieved a lot in really dismantling the Anglo-Irish Treaty, socially, he really let a lot of Irish people down in how they ran the economy. Remember, we looked at they used a protectionist policy, and it really affected the Irish economy. Conditions, they barely improved from the times of the emergency. While other countries will begin to see a boom, especially in the 50s, Ireland will be stuck in pretty horrific poverty. Immigration again was on the rise. We talked about how 500,000 people had left in the 1920s and 30s. Even after the war had ended, immigration rose. 24,000 people left in 1945, 40,000 left in 1948 because conditions were better. And even though more people were leaving, the level of unemployment actually went up in the country, just to show how bad the place was economically. And rationing was still being used in many years after the war. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So by now you guys should know what the terms neutral, rations and Glimmerman mean. You guys should know the three major threats to Irish neutrality, coming from the IRA, coming from the British, and coming from the Germans. And finally, you guys should know three things about life in Ireland during the emergency. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.